Hey guys, Chad Hoover, Kayak Bassing TV, and today we're going to talk about what I use to transition from late summer into early fall. All right, so one of the great things about fall is things start to heat up as they start to cool down. As the photo period changes and the bass start to migrate following shad, it really is one of those times of year where you can catch some of the biggest fish of the year and you can have quality numbers days. So it's a great time of year to go out and get your confidence up, but it's also a great time of year to get a kid or an inexperienced angler into fishing and excited about it. All right, so early fall is one of my favorite times to fish because the boat traffic starts to slow down on public lakes. The photo period changes, the fish start to get more active and they start to put the feed bag on. What that means is I can get really good evening bites and I can hang out and fish a couple hours after dark and get some awesome activity, especially on topwater. I'm a self-professed topwater fanatic and I really like to fish when fish start to move up into the grass. Now, in late summer, it's the hottest time of the year, so fish have started to really focus and hang around vegetation. That vegetation is gonna put oxygen back in the water. It's gonna be the most oxygen-rich water, and that's also the first place that they're gonna stage to ambush migratory species as they start to move up creek mouths and they start to move shallow. So let's talk about my top 5 favorite lures for fishing in the fall. But what I'm not gonna do is eliminate stuff that I also use for the sake of making a video that does well in the YouTube algorithm. I'm actually gonna tell you my top 5 favorites, but then I'm gonna talk about some honorable mentions and things that I also use and when you should use those as well. So guys, I'm a self-professed frog fishing fanatic, okay? And fall is one of my favorite times to fish a hollow body frog, to fish a topwater soft plastic toad, and to fish a hybrid frog, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And here's why. When you frog fish in the spring, the water is warming up, so the fish's metabolism is just starting to get more active. So during that time of the year, I like to use more of a popper style frog. I like to use a frog that's got a cup mouth. I pop it through the water column. It creates a disturbance, but it sits in the strike zone a little longer because the fish aren't that aggressive or they aren't as aggressive. When the water's warm but starting to cool off, it really invigorates the fish, but they are super aggressive. Now, just imagine when things first start to cool off for you, how much more active you get out in the yard, how much more active you get getting ready for the fall. And I hate to personify fish, but they're a lot, they act a lot, but they act the same in a lot of instances, and one of those is how they feed on topwater baits. So let's break down topwater frogs into 3 different categories. I'm gonna call a hollow body one category, but I'm gonna tell you that I don't use the popper style in the fall. I'm more of a fan of the walk the dog style, the hollow body ones. I go from a really skinny, narrow profile so I can fish it super fast to a little bit wider. You know, the Spro frog is one of my favorite, but I also like the little bit wider profile on the sexy dog style. I put it right here somewhere. Yeah, the sexy dog style from Strike King. If you watched my video earlier, I talk about how to make the legs. Frog legs was the name of the video. You can go check that out, but I'm gonna demonstrate it for you really quickly. This one's right out of the package, and I feel like the skirts are always too long. So I simply grab the legs, I fold them back, and I trim them off. Now, in the fall, I actually give it about an extra 1/4 of an inch because I'm gonna tie a loop knot for my frog because I want it to walk the dog, because I'm gonna fish it a lot faster. Because the fish are a lot more aggressive, the grass is starting to get a little less dense. It's starting to separate, so there's pockets in there, and those fish are reaction bite, they're ambush feeding, and they're looking for opportunities to feed because they have to put on weight to survive the long winter. The second category of frog, which is also more commonly referred to as a toad, but is still in that topwater frog family, is a soft plastic style toad. 2 of my favorites, and probably the 2 that I primarily use, is a Zoom horny toad and this Incredible frog from Culprit. Now, the reason that I really like this Incredible frog from Culprit in the fall, more so than in the wintertime, is I like to fish it on a little bit of a weighted hook. I like the fact that it's a little denser and a little heavier than the Zoom horny toad, and these legs have a little bit more action, and by pushing down in the water, because the leg attachment part is so thin, you get a lot of action, a lot of gurgle, and you can reel it super fast or you can slow it down just a bit. And this frog acts, this toad acts really well. This Incredible frog from Culprit acts really good, and you can burn it, you can slow it down just a bit, but this is a fast moving bait. So I'm going to talk about the 3 types of baits: a fast moving, intermediate, and a slow moving. And those are baits that when I'm talking about this time of year, they're all still relatively fast. I'm just talking about, you know, dividing it down. I don't really fish frogs slow in the fall. I'm looking for that reaction bite. The days are shorter, so I'm trying to cover more water and present to more fish, so I've got a better opportunity to catch them. So this is my fast, my super fast, as fast as I can reel it. I'm throwing that culprit and credit frog, and I'm throwing that zoom horny toad. In the intermediate category, I'm looking at something like this, and this is a bit of a hybrid. So this is the top toad from Stanley, and the reason that I say it's kind of in the middle is I can tie a loop knot on this, I can tie an improved clinch if I want to direct reel it, or I can tie a Palomar directly to braid, and I can fish this thing as fast or as slow as I want it to. And so when I'm in the off-peak periods, I can slow reel this through a pocket and I can get blow-ups, or I can burn it, but it's a hollow body and soft plastic frog mixed together, and that's the top toad from Stanley. So basically during my transition periods, I really like to throw this bait. I like to use the keel weighted double take hook. This thing pops in there real easy, and then I get a really good hookup ratio. And what's also great about this frog is it's easy to add scent to, because you can put it inside the cavity. You can pre-soak them before you go out at night, so when that fish blows up and you drop your rod tip, it just seems more real. It gives you that extra second, that pause you need to set the hook, and with that double take hook, you really get a great hookup ratio. So that's my intermediate style frog, and that's the one that I'm using in those intermediate speeds. And then even though I'm fishing it as fast as I can possibly fish it, I still consider a hollow body a bit of the slower on the end of the spectrum for fishing frogs in the fall, because they are a little bit more involved in working. You got to kind of pop your rod tip. And so what you want to do is you want to drop, hop, reel, drop, hop, reel, and you just kind of get that cadence. And you're basically, as long as your hands are going in opposite direction, you got that rod at the 12 o'clock position, and that nose is kind of bouncing along, or when you drop it, you're giving it a little slack, it's walking side to side. The way you accomplish that is to tie a loop knot if you want it to walk the dog, and make the legs a little bit shorter, and then tie a direct knot and make the legs a little bit longer if you want it to kind of hop and stay straight. And so those are the 2 ways that I fish my hollow body frogs in the fall. I like to cover a lot of water like I talked about with these other baits, and one of the reasons that I really like a hollow body frog is I can take it, add a little scent to it, but ease it down in the water, squeeze it about halfway, let it draw in a lot of water, and that's going to make it a little heavier. It's going to allow me to cast it further, and then whatever water is still inside it when it hits the water is going to sit it at an up attitude, which is going to make it bulge a little more, and it's also going to make that nose walk back and forth. And so I really like doing that. I'll sometimes drop tungsten beads in here. I'll drop BBs in there to give it a little click and clatter to draw in some of those more lethargic fish, but in off-peak periods. But when the fish are super aggressive, and you find a grass mat that's holding fish, or a lily pad field that's holding fish, they're going to blow up a frog, as long as they're not suspect of you being there, as long as they're not wary because there's been a lot of boat traffic in the area. And that's one of my favorite techniques. Now, the frogs are obviously something I'm fishing in vegetation, but here's what starts to happen as your evenings start to cool off, and when your nights start to get colder, and then your days are warmer, like we have today. We had lows in the 60s this morning, but it's going to be somewhere in the mid to upper 70s during the day. Fish start to relate to wood near grass. So if you can find submerged wood near grass, or submerged wood in grass, that wood is going to absorb heat throughout the course of the day. It's going to release that heat back into the water at night. So in the evening time, fish will pull next to that wood, and they'll stay next to it until the sun starts to come up in the middle of the day, and they'll move their way back into the grass in the mornings. So one of my favorite baits for fishing open water, and one of my favorite baits all around, is the Whopper Popper. If you guys have watched my channel any period of time, you know I was one of the first people out there that was a Whopper Popper evangelist. I love the bait. When they first came out with it, it only came in 2 sizes. With the increased popularity of it and the increased demand, they've been able to expand the product line. But I throw every size of Whopper Popper, and not just for musky, big toothy critters and for giant fish like striper. I actually throw all the sizes for largemouth bass. Now, the reason that I do that is because fish are all about the law of conservation of energy. They want to expend the least amount of energy for the maximum return on investment. So if you had to run a mile to eat a Cheeto, or if you had to walk 3 feet to eat a cheeseburger, which would you do? Well, you're probably going to walk 3 feet and eat a cheeseburger, and that's exactly what big female bass that are feeding up for the wintertime are going to do. So if you're fishing the Whopper Popper 90 and it's moving really fast and you got to chase it down, that's walking 3 miles to eat a Cheeto. But if you're throwing this 190 size and you're reeling it a little slower because you can, because it churns more water, because it kicks up more of a wake and it's slower, you can fish it a lot slower, then that's that cheeseburger you're gonna walk 3 feet for. So I'm a big bait, big bass kind of guy, except for in the fall. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the beginning because, you know, elephants also eat peanuts. But for the sake of this discussion, I really like to use all 3 sizes of Whopper Poppers. And here's how I break it down. If I've got low light conditions, if I've got shallow wood, and the bass doesn't have to expend a lot of energy to get there, I'm gonna be throwing this super big, super loud, big pattern, big contrasted 190 size Whopper Popper. I like to fish it really in 2 colors, all right? They're not cheap, so I don't have 15 of these, okay? I really keep it pretty simple. I've got the loon color in black when I want contrast, when the water's muddy, stained, or if it's overcast. And then I've got the bone color. When I got clear water, I got high, clear skies, but I really like those 2 colors for contrast purposes. The bone does really well until your sun is almost directly overhead, and then I switch back to the black. Once it gets a little bit lower in the sky, up until it's almost below the treetop, I fish the bone. So I fish this bone about 80% of the time, but when the sun's about 15 degrees off the horizon, 15 degrees off the horizon or directly overhead, or if I've got really muddy water, I'm fishing this black loon color. I'm throwing these early, and I'm throwing these when I've got shallow wood without a lot of vegetation. I've got big bait fish in the area, and I know I've got big bass. If I'm exploring, I kind of split the difference, and I really like to use this 130 size. The first Whopper Popper that I ever fished was one of the 130s. It's one of the more popular ones. I really like this chrome blue and a little bit of flash, and I changed my hooks out to a saltwater silver hook in the fall because the shad are migrating, they're moving up the creek channels, and anything with flash is gonna do really well. Anything that's silverish blue is gonna do really well for those fish that are feeding on those migrating shad. Now, one of the things that I really like to do, and I want to show you the contrast here, is I like to remove this stock hook on all of my Whopper Poppers except the 90. And that's the one that most people complain about, but I'm going to tell you why I don't, and I'm going to tell you why I do change it on my 130 size. This is my most popular size. It's the one I throw more than the 130, I mean the 190. It's the one I throw more than the 90, and I just added the 110 to the mix. So this is the lure that I've caught the most big fish on. It's the one that I've caught my personal best on video. Not my personal best, but the personal best that we actually captured on video. And it's one that is my go-to bait for catching big fish. The only downside to this hook, to this lure, if there is one, is the hooks that they provide are a little bit soft and they're a little bit undersized. The other thing that I don't really like about this bait right out of the package is I don't feel like it's balanced to the rear enough. I really like to have that nose up. And so when I'm fishing it, I hold my rod tip at the 12 o'clock position, I reel it, which raises that nose up a little bit, but I add a bigger hook to the back, a really big hook to the back. One of the things you gotta keep in mind is that it will actually catch on the propeller. So when you cast it, you kind of have to feather your cast so it lands in a, when it lands facing away from you, and raise your rod tip just as it hits the water. That'll keep that from fouling up. So if you start reeling it pretty much as soon as it hits the water and you don't throw it up in the air and let it go under and come back up, you don't have to worry about it fouling as much. But when you upgrade that hook from that number 2 or number 6 that it comes with, that number 4, number 6 that it comes with, up to that number 2 heavy gauge treble, that thing right there, for one, in fall, a lot of times they're swiping at the baits. A lot of times there's a lot of bait fish in the area, and you're gonna be scattering bait as you bring this through schools of shad. And so I like that bigger hook for that purpose. I like the round bend in early fall. I'll switch to a more triple threat, triple bend kind of angled in when I get a little later into the fall, into early winter. But early fall, late summer, I really like a round bend. It gives me a better hookup ratio for those fish that are kind of slashing. As it gets a little cooler, they'll swim up behind it and kind of slurp it down, and then you'll go more towards the style of hook that comes on the new 110 size. Now, if you can only buy one, if you say to yourself, Chad, these things are expensive, I don't fish for a living like you do, and you can only buy one Whopper Popper, right, to give it a shot, buy the new 110 size. The 110 is that happy medium. It's between the 90 and the 130. It's something that you'll have confidence in if you don't believe in throwing, these giant baits. You'll catch a lot of fish on it, but you can get it into tighter places. It runs a little shallower, so you don't have to have as much clearance over the wood as you do with a 130 or a 190 size. It comes with these super heavy gauge hooks right out of the package. The folks at River to Sea have listened and they've upgraded that. And so you've got a little bit of a triple grip style hook where the hook point is angled back in, and that is going to be really good for going over wood because that hook point is not going to catch. So you can fish this thing like a buzz bait and a topwater walk the dog style bait in one. I'm not a big fan of the start and stop. I've seen videos where people are catching big fish on the start and stop. I think a lot of times that's happening in private water ponds and places where the fish aren't that pressured and they would hit damn near anything. But when I'm fishing heavily pressured public waters, at the time when the pressure starts to drop off and I want to catch big fish, I like to fish this thing on a steady retrieve. That means cast it out, get a good cadence. I reel it as fast as I can before it starts to skip, meaning when this tail starts to lose traction and starts to skip and cavitate, I slow it down just a little bit below that and I keep it at that speed. It creates a good wake, it creates a good cadence, and it allows that bass to track that bait. So the topwater frog and the Whopper Popper are my two favorite baits for fishing vegetation and then fishing open water, wood, and starting to work my way to the back of creeks. The main reason that I like the Whopper Popper for starting to work my way to the back of creeks is I don't have to pick my paddle up. And I can use the Whopper Popper as a bit of a motor. As I throw it out and reel it in, it's gonna slowly draw my kayak along. I'm gonna ease my kayak left and ease my kayak right and kind of work my way down. If you pay attention to the way shad orient to a creek in the fall, they generally don't orient into the banks. They're not moving up there to stage. They're working their way up the creeks, they're migrating up there, and so they're generally in the center of the creek. So I like to fish one side of the center or the other, not the bank, but one side of the center or the other, and throw at 45-degree angles, crisscrossing the center of the creek, because that's where the fish are gonna be. When they're active, they kill a Whopper Popper. When they're not, they're gonna kill the next three baits that I'm gonna tell you about. This video's run a little bit long, so I'm gonna break this up into two videos. So my top two favorite baits for fall are a hollow body or a frog, hollow body, soft plastic, or that intermediate hybrid style like the top toad, and the Whopper Popper from River to Sea. Do me a favor, give this video a big thumbs up if you like it. Leave a comment below if you think that there's better lures out there, and be sure to watch for part 2 where I talk about my next 3 favorite lures for fishing the late summer into early fall transition.